Hi, I'm Naira, and they are Emilio, Irene, José, and Vicência. Today, we're going to talk about the effectiveness of countercyclical fiscal policies, the risk of stagflation, and the impact on future generations. The topics to be addressed are: what are countercyclical fiscal policies, automatic stabilizing recession, risk of stagflation, quantitative easing, the impact on future generations, and our conclusion. This work was elaborated in the scope of the curricular unit of taxation by Professor Natasha in the Economics course of Portugalense University, with the main objective to understand one of the macroeconomic measures used against the current pandemic, related topics, and their impact on future generations.
Today I will talk about two important aspects of the world. First of all, the countercyclical fiscal policy, which consists of a set of actions for bullish and recessionary periods. In periods where the cycle is expansions, the government must accumulate and save resources. On the other hand, when it is a recession, you must spend resources to stimulate the economy, which implies public deficit. We all know that is a delicate balance between the proper use of revenue and expenses. The other words, when things are wrong, given should be incurred at rated expensive. Also, there are two countercyclical policies. The monetary policy, I think, is the most important, that concerns to central banks. They establish price and the tax of interest must be zero. And the other one, the fiscal policy, that are means to tax to all the citizens. Then, on the other hand, the automatic stabilizers in recessions, there are a set of public and private budgets. The main stabilizers are income, like consumptions and aggregate demand, in addition to others. As we can see on the graph, in times of recessions, the tax resources are lower, and in deficit spending increases, and the income are going down. The automatic stabilizers act state spending on unemployment at the time of recession. There is more spending due to unemployment. In case that the aggregate demand is lower, the automatic stabilizers increase, like consumption and investment.
Okay, before we dive deep into the effectiveness of countercyclical fiscal policies, I would like to introduce you with a concept called the Cobra effect. So in New Delhi, in India, the local government was concerned about the huge number of venomous snakes, so they offered a bounty for every cobra that anyone could find. And initially, this incentive was a successful strategy. A large number of snakes were killed for the reward. But as the population of snakes decreased and the difficulty to find more snakes in the nature increased, people began to breed snakes indoors to take advantage and keep profiting from this incentive. Although, when the government became aware of this, obviously, the reward program was revoked, and in response, the cobra breeders released all the now worthless snake for free. And at the end, the number of snakes in New Delhi was bigger than before the implementation of these measures. So, the non-intentional consequences of trying to eradicate the snakes was an increase of this reptile species, and this is what is called a perversive incentive. So, with this work study, we aim to analyze the effectiveness of countercyclical fiscal policies and if they are in fact a good solution to face recessions or if it will result in a bigger problem like the Cobra effect describes. Okay, so I hope everyone is following up, and let's go a little bit more deeper. This graphic is demonstrating the divergence in the recovery between the US and the EU. Both the US administrations, Biden and Trump, have used an unprecedented fiscal stimulus combined with Fed dovish monetary policies that should contribute to a faster economic recovery. A big part of the fast recovery in the US is due to the size of the fiscal stimulus, especially the 1.9 trillion from the CARES Act. Although it creates a potential for the economic overheating that could complicate monetary policy. Stronger growth will be accompanied with higher inflation and potential risks for financial crises within the next 3 years. In contrast with Europe, that had a more prudent, hawkish approach, and in result started to lose international competitiveness with an imminent risk of serious short-term contraction. They announced a fiscal stimulus as well, but it's way smaller. Okay, so with the help of this graphic, we can understand better the reason of the divergence in growth between the US and EU. In the blue bars, we have the proposed stimulus, and in the pink bars, it's GDP contraction between the EU, Portugal, and the US. We can observe that Portugal had a big GDP contraction of minus 7.6% due to our economic sensibility. Europe's fiscal policy response is too modest both during the pandemic and now in the recovery. EU is not a federation. It does not have a federal authority that primarily centralizes fiscal policy, which is of course much more complicated to manage the externalities, asymmetries and trade-offs of such magnitude stimulus, hence why EU had to adopt a prudent approach that reflects a hawkish position with lower inflation targets. But what I want to highlight in this graph is that even though the US had the smallest drop in GDP during 2020, it's in the US that fiscal policy is being more aggressive with this huge fiscal stimulus that might actually overheat the economy and might lead to inflation being higher than what it should be or Fed expected to be.
I'm going to talk about the risk of stagflation. To understand better, stagflation is a combination of stagnation and inflation. In a normal market, passive growth prevents inflation, and stagnation can only happen if the policies of the governments rattle the normal function of the economy. Inflation, we all know, that is the general increase in prices, and stagnation is the growth slow of the economy. These two components affect the gross domestic product, which is all that is produced in a given territory. We all know in Portuguese has PIB. Why does the stagflation happen? The stagflation happened, as I say in the PowerPoint, because of the state intervention, excess of demand, and decline in production. But we will focus on government or state intervention, the fiscal policies. So the question is, with the current situation, there is a risk of stagflation. So, according to our theme, we are analyzing the fiscal policies of the government in the context of COVID-19, because we all know that the government have not measured their efforts to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on the economy. Unemployment is the bigger effect because affect all the economy, all country. And like everything in life, it has advantages and disadvantages, because obviously not all economy are the same. So even though COVID is affecting everyone, it will not have the same after effects, because some economy is already experienced crises that have not yet been resolved. So in addition, they need to create measures to mitigate COVID effects. They also have to create measures to mitigate crisis effects. So it's a mix of policies. As I say in the PowerPoint, excessive of fiscal policies and countries with unsustainable economies. We know that there are countries with control of their economy, just as we know that there is some countries with no that such control of the economy. So, in my point of view, the countries or the economies that will suffer more with these COVID effects are that countries that are unsustainable or in development, because the risk of stagflation is high, because they need to go through some crisis. They need to go through COVID-19. So it's a lot of policies, it is a lot of things to go through. So to complete, There is a great risk of stagflation in the whole world, but the risk is higher in that economies that are unsustainable, because the government should have a longer view of the effects of their policies, because there will be a post-pandemic time.
Quantitative easing. It's a countercyclical fiscal policy used in times of recession. It's considered to be one of the most aggressive macroeconomic political tools in the Western economy, and it's also a monetary stimulus strategy used by the central bank, which is done through the purchase of public and private securities, in other words, financial assets. The objective is to increase the money circulating in the economy, resulting in a fast growth of this economy. It is used in times of severe crisis or economic stagnation, because when the amount of money circulating in the economy increases, long-term interest rates are reduced, resulting in reduction of borrowing costs, which stimulates the economic growth. Historically, the Bank of Japan has been implementing this policy since the 90s. The European Central Bank and the British Bank also used it in the beginning of 2007 crisis, as well as the United States Federal Reserve System, which started using the quantitative easing against the Great Recession of 2008. And for example, between 2009 and 2014, the Fed bought more than $4 trillion in assets. Based on this graph, it's possible to perceive the fast growth of the monetary aggregate. Look to 2007 to 2008, the central banks used the quantitative easing to increase the monetary base quickly. We can see it was a huge growth. But everything has a bad side, so what is the bad side of quantitative easing? According to the professor at National University of Singapore's Gulkinya, as quantitative easing reduces long-term interest rates, a low-cost financing environment can stimulate blind optimism and excessive speculative behavior, which will lead to a rapid expansion of debt and increased market risks. In addition, quantitative easing can lead to excessive issuance of money and increased asset bubbles, especially in the stock market, where prices are inflated. And globally, quantitative easing is expected to generate more debt and market risk in other countries, especially for emerging economies. To explain it better, it's possible to mention that the monetary base would represent the wealth of a country's economy, has a positive direct interrelation with the inflation. That means when the monetary base increases, the inflation increases. When the monetary base decreases, the inflation decreases, even with a delay. Therefore, when there is a strong fall in the monetary base, which involves an increase in the level of employment and low purchasing power, there is a sharp drop in inflation, which is not healthy for the economy. Besides that, the effects of this measure will be exported to the international market, which mainly affects emerging economies that are only price takers. Then, with the use of a temporary quantitative easing, the central bank would return the fall in the monetary base, not increase the inflation, as would only be returning it. The increase in inflation would happen only if the use of quantitative easing was continuous, and if the government does use the contractionary measures at the time of excessive expansion.
Well, I am going to talk about the impact of future generations. So, price stability and full employment in countries' economies are extremely important factors in ensuring a sustainable economy. Nowadays, the most talked about is stem COVID-19, which has brutally affected the world. Preventive measures are created to improve the functioning of financial markets, full employment, health, education, and the dependence of foreigners. All of this to guarantee macroeconomic stability, reasonable employment rate, great conditions for future economic growth, and control of control of stagflation. A public debt fiscal policies are important to improve the economy, but at some time, if used for long periods, they can generate losses such as high levels of indebtedness, higher interest rates, lower wages, stagflation of the economy. So there are countries such as Japan, Greece, Italy, and Portugal that have high level of indebtedness, for which they must find a balance point in the short term for the long term recovery phase. The Portuguese economy reached 386.80% for GDP at the end of 2020. According to Portugal Bank, Portugal has 314.5 million of public debt and 403 million for private debt. If countries fail to close the balance sheet and the economy goes toward a high and no longer bearable debts, the government will be forced to reduce the impact of spending on its debt.
In response to exogenous shocks that led to the shutdown of service sectors, the world has witnessed unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus, deployed by governments and central banks like never before. The lockdown measures to contain the spread of the virus interrupted supply chains that resulted in the biggest contraction of global trade. This stimulus measure represents an extraordinary policy response to a new type of crisis. And as a final point, when countries don't adopt a full countercyclical position, and by this we mean to contract in times of expansion and to expand in times of contraction, it's really imperative to use both to promote a sustainable growth, since countercyclical policies can be misused to hide structural problems. Otherwise, nations can keep printing money infinitely in order to neglect these issues, and this will result in bigger problems like the Cobra effect described. It's a Pandora box waiting to be unleashed, since these measures have a cost that will have to be repaid, and this is where the problem lies. When countries don't increase the tax rates in good times in order to have a surplus of liquidity, a sustainable, well-managed public debt, and bigger margins to accommodate changes in interest rates and tax rates. All of this results sooner or later in austerity, when a country goes solvent and their public debt interest rate rises, like in 2008, when many countries entered in default with no institution interested in lending more money, and in consequence they lost sovereignty and were coerced to implement austerity on their citizens, with wage and social support cuts, huge tax burdens, in which resulted in nefarious costs for the society, especially the lower band branches, elderly and disabled.